Hi, I'm Clyde Haberman of the New York Times, filling in for Sam Roberts. Inflation and the price of pretty much everything remains top of the mind for most people. The Federal Reserve just increased interest rates for the fourth time this year, and this move will have an impact on both borrowing and the price of consumer goods. As gas prices continue to stay high despite recent declines, and as inflation remains, how much of an impact will this move make? Can some of our woes be blamed on what has been called greedflation? Here to help explain the impact on us all is Jeanna Smialek, joining us from Washington. Jeanna, welcome to Close Up, and it's a very busy time for you, so thank you. Are we, in fact, in a recession? President Biden says no, others say no, but if it feels like a recession, is it?
I think the answer is we actually don't know yet. So here in the United States, we have sort of two definitions for a recession. One is just the sort of conventional Wall Street definition, and one is the official definition. That first conventional definition is 2 quarters of consecutive decline in gross domestic product, which is sort of the biggest measure of output in the economy.
Which is what we have, right? We have that.
As of this morning, right. As of this morning, we got a data point suggesting we got that. But those data get really heavily revised. So there's every reason to think that the next print could revise that into positive territory. You know, it's not guaranteed, but it could definitely happen. So it is just too soon to say. The other sort of wrinkle in this is that that measure is unofficial. The way we officially define recession here in the United States is a recession as called by the National Bureau of Economic Research dating committee. So when they say we're in a recession, that is when we are in a recession. And that is about more than just a decline in GDP. They often take a lot of signal from the job market. Right. And in this instance, the job market is actually still roaring. And so we're hiring a lot of people. Wage growth is still very strong. And so, you know, it's just too early to tell if we are actually in a recession.
As you reported this week, the Fed raised the interest rates again by 0.75 of a percentage point. Can you walk us through the pros and cons of the Fed going too fast, going too slowly? Is there such a thing as a Goldilocks strategy, one that feels just right, or is that pie in the sky? And for that matter, are there other tools in the kit other than raising interest rates?
So on the Goldilocks question, the Fed really hopes that they are going to hit that Goldilocks scenario where they cool the economy down just enough, but not too much. And so inflation comes down, but they don't tip us into recession. It is really hard to know where that level is, how you achieve that perfect outcome, especially because interest rates are a very blunt tool. It's hard to know how they're going to affect the economy in advance. You know directionally, but you don't know precisely. And so, you know, there is a real risk as they make borrowing much more expensive at basically the fastest pace of increase since the 1980s. You know, we haven't seen this kind of activity from the Fed in decades, in my lifetime. So there is a real risk of recession. The second question I think you asked, I think is the really important one, which is, are there better ways to do this? Could we solve this inflation problem with something less potentially painful than interest rate increases? And I think if you ask the Fed, they would say, you know, the reason we're pursuing this policy path is because there's nothing else that's quite as fast. You know, interest rates take a little while to trickle through the economy, but they pretty quickly start to address these rapid price pressures. Whereas the things we can do on the fiscal policy side, so Congress's spending and taxing decisions and the White House's decisions, those things take a little bit longer to make meaningful change. So it takes a while to build a bridge, it takes a while to build a road, it takes a while to ramp up factory production by building more factories. Those aren't quick solutions. The Fed solution is relatively rapid.
Going back half a century to the Nixon administration, President Nixon, a Republican, nonetheless imposed wage and price controls. We've not seen that as inflation was pretty strong back then during the Vietnam War. Is that just a tactic that is out the window and nobody even thinks about it?
Yeah, you know, that is an excellent question because as you kind of allude to here, that is one faster thing that the White House and president can do. Unfortunately, I think the reason that we don't think those are good tools to use in this modern era is partially because of the legacy of the Nixon wage and price controls. You know, what we saw in the Nixon instance is they did pretty clearly weigh on wages and prices in the moment, wage growth obviously was capped and prices didn't go up more than a certain amount. But then as soon as they came off, we got revenge inflation. We saw inflation spike up to sort of make up for the profits the companies had lost during the period when the controls were in place. And so you don't want that. Obviously, that's just going to result in more inflation down the road. Kicking the can down the road is not the same as solving the problem. And I think that sort of legacy that those wage and price controls got has really sort of dogged that policy ever since.
Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, to what degree does he take political considerations into account of what's going to fly, what's going to, bring all hell down on him from various politicians? I shouldn't say he obviously, I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet that he's more comfortable with the President Biden than he was with the President Trump. But again, to what degree is the Fed a political creature, and to what degree is it above it all and only deals with economic theory and reality?
I think Jay Powell's Fed is very apolitical, actually, and I don't think I have to state that as an opinion. I think we have a pretty decent amount of evidence to back that up. I think obviously for the prior presidency, Jay Powell's first several years in office as chair, we saw President Trump just constantly pushing the Fed to lower interest rates by more, to help them in his trade wars, to be more proactive in trying to stoke the economy. And we saw the Fed really resisting that pressure campaign, just not engaging with the White House. Likewise, we obviously have a lot of Democrats now who don't think that this is the best way to fight inflation. Elizabeth Warren just penned a very widely read and widely cited column this weekend saying that this isn't the right way to solve this problem. And you see absolutely no sign that the Fed is sort of taking that kind of pressure into consideration, or really sort of caving to any kind of outside political consideration as they make their policy choices.
I referred in my introduction to greedflation, a term that has come around, terrible neologism if I've ever heard one, but it exists. What does it refer to? Are there companies that are simply raising prices not because they need to cover costs, but just because they can? And is this a widespread problem or hit and miss?
So greedflation has, I think, a couple of different definitions as it is popularly used, but I'll just recite the most common one, which is when people talk about greedflation, they usually mean that companies are taking advantage of a moment of sort of mass confusion in order to raise prices and swell their profits. And I would say unambiguously, we have seen that. That is happening. There are definitely companies who are raising their prices more than their costs are rising and taking home bigger profits. So you can just see that in the pure data. That is definitely true. I would also say that's a pretty regular feature of capitalism. We live in a society where corporations are what every business school teaches as profit maximizing. They try and make their profits as big as they possibly can. What has changed here is that they're able to do that through prices in the sort of post-2020 era. And I think the key question is not, are these companies taking advantage of the moment? It's like, why are they able to take advantage of the moment? Because they always wanted to do this, but suddenly they're capable of doing it in a way that they previously weren't. And I think the answer there is that we are in this moment where people understand that where a lot of companies are experiencing cost shocks, they realize that prices are increasing, and they're maybe not shopping around as much when they see price increases because they are cognizant of this inflation. And that is how we're getting some of this inflation that we're getting. That's how corporations are managing to swell their profits. We also may be seeing a turn in this cycle. You're seeing some corporations like Walmart, for example, warn that, customers are really substituting away from expensive products. They're really sort of starting to cut back on things like clothing and luxury purchases as they increasingly need to just buy food because food has gotten so expensive. And so I think that could potentially be good news for the outlook for inflation. Obviously, very bad news for consumers, but good news for the outlook for inflation, and that this period of very high profits may not last too much longer.
Well, I hope so. I hope that's the case. My yardstick is cupcakes. I bought 4 cupcakes yesterday, and I was shocked at the price. Those are the last cupcakes I'm buying for a while. Can you assess the impact that the war in Ukraine is having on our economy, and to what degree does our aid to Ukraine perhaps become a little unsustainable economically?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the war on Ukraine, I would say, is having myriad effects on our economy, but the one that is most visible is the way it's affecting prices here. And so when the when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw a real spike up in a variety of commodity markets just because Ukraine and Russia are both big producers of some key commodities, including food, particularly grain, oil, and natural gas. And so those spike ups have really helped to elevate a lot of prices across the entire economy because not only are those commodities things we consume, but they go into a lot of other things we consume. And so that disruption has been meaningful from an inflation standpoint. Also, obviously meaningful from a growth standpoint, because as people pay more for gas and food, they pay less for everything else. They don't have as much money to go around. And so you see them pulling back from other types of businesses, other businesses hire less, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of knock-on effects here. I think that the question of aid is a tricky one because, as most of your listeners probably know, it's not so much the case that the U.S. has some finite amount of money it can or cannot spend. It is often the case that it doesn't want to spend a lot of money in an inflationary moment because it doesn't want to sort of overtax an economy that is already running up against its limits. But defense spending tends to not really do that because it's going to some other part of the economy. And so I think that, far be it for me to assess whether this is too much or too little. I think that's a national security question and just really not my bailiwick. But I think that those are some of the considerations to think about when you're looking at these packages.
The employment picture, though, is pretty good, right? I mean, unemployment is down to, very low levels in the 3% range. And so on balance, is the economy really in wretched shape? It would seem not, objectively speaking, to me anyway, but I'm not the expert.
It is a very weird economic moment, and I think the experts are having a really hard time assessing what is going on here because, as you mentioned, the job market looks fantastic. We have 3.6% unemployment. We have more job openings than we've ever recorded. We haven't been recording that long, but still, it's a lot. And we have very decent wage growth. Wage growth has looked pretty good. It's not keeping up with inflation for most people, but it's about as strong as we've seen it in recent decades. And so I think the question is, why are people still feeling so bad despite all of that? And I think a lot of it ties back to what we've just talked about, sort of the fact that there is just so much uncertainty. The war in Ukraine is stoking more uncertainty. The pandemic sort of hangs over all of our heads like a dark cloud at all times. And obviously we have these very, very rapidly increasing prices, and people really don't like inflation. I think when people lose a job or get a job, they feel like there's some amount of personal loss or accomplishment there. But when people just pay more for the products that they were buying last week, I think they feel like they're losing something of no fault of their own. And so I think that, you do have sort of the psychological impact of these rising prices really does seem to be weighing on people's minds.
Okay, thank you. Jeanna Smialek, Times economics reporter. If I can get you back another time, I want to talk about pop music that reflects the economic hard times. I'm thinking of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime from the Great Depression. Up next, the state of COVID-19 and continued worries about the monkeypox virus. The COVID-19 pandemic has slowed, but it hasn't left our lives for good. President Biden recently got it, almost as a reminder to the rest of us that, yes, it's still here and it's still contagious. At the same time, the monkeypox virus is still spreading and has been declared, with some controversy, a global health emergency. What does the future hold for yet another contagious virus? My next guest has been covering the monkeypox story and more since the first case of monkeypox appeared in the U.S. in May. Apoorva Mandavilli is a health and science reporter for the Times, and she joins me now. Welcome. Is there an end to COVID, or should we just simply resign ourselves? It's here to stay for quite a while, and we'll figure out how to live with it one way or another.
I think we already have resigned ourselves to it. And it's probably for the best because it will be here for a really long time. Exactly how it is, will it cause a lot of surges? Will there just be sort of a small number of infections throughout the year? That remains to be seen over the long term. But at least for the next 2 to 3 years, I think we're looking at a repeat of what we've seen this year.
And why has this been so persistent? I mean, the great pandemic of a century ago did not last this long, I believe. It was certainly more of a killer, I think, than this coronavirus has been. Nonetheless, by the early 1920s, I believe everybody was dancing to Charleston and trying to find bootleg booze. Why is this one so different?
Part of what's different is that it's a coronavirus, which we haven't really been exposed to in this particular way for a very long time, possibly ever. We've had seasonal coronaviruses, but if you think about the flu, which is what the 1918 one was, we've all been exposed to the flu throughout our lives. We have some level of immunity. Flu's been around for millions of years, so we've had a lot of time as a species to adapt to it. So I don't know that the virus fully disappeared, the one that was in 1918. I think it may have just faded into the background. And this one too, hopefully will eventually do that. I mean, the seasonal coronaviruses that cause common colds, there's some hypothesis that those were also pandemics at some point, or at least large epidemics, and then they have sort of transformed over time into these more benign versions. And hopefully that'll be the case for this one.
Can you explain why the vaccinations, I've now been vaccinated 4 times, including 2 boosters. I assume you have also. Why do the effects of these vaccinations not last as long as those for polio, for example, or the MMR shots that every kid hopefully is getting? Is there something in the nature of the virus, or is it in the nature of the vaccine?
Well, it's the nature of the virus for the most part. The virus is changing, and so what we fought against, exactly. And we've given it a lot of opportunity. I mean, we've had, millions and hundreds of millions of people infected, and the virus has had a lot of chances to mutate, to keep finding new ways to infect us. And so I think it's important, though, to distinguish the fact that we are still immune for the most part, most of us, in terms of severe illness. So that still holds up. It's the immunity, the protection against infection that seems to go down over time, and some of that is natural. When you first encounter a pathogen, your body sort of revs up, you make all these antibodies, but you can't stay in that state of high alert. You do have to come down at some point, and that is what happens with just about any infection. But in terms of why the vaccination in this case doesn't last a lifetime, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the virus is changing, and so we have to change with it. We have to change the vaccines with it.
Okay. And that would probably be the more accepted way to do it rather than change our habits, since I think, again, we're all tired of, I'm on the subway most days, and almost every day there seem to be more and more people unmasked. A lot of them are visitors, but I could tell, but it's a little, I don't know whether to be worried or whether to throw my own mask away.
It is confusing. I mean, I took the subway here this morning, and I think I was the only one in my car wearing one.
Wow.
I think there is a sense that the virus has either gone away or that people just don't want to hear about it. It's there maybe, but they just don't want to care. And it is really a shame in a lot of ways. One, because people who get infected may actually develop long-term symptoms. It's not as if, getting infected is nothing. But also because every time people get infected, we are still giving the virus more chances to keep mutating. Every time the virus infects somebody, it's like a playground for it to experiment and make new versions of itself. So we are continuing to allow it to prosper.
A couple of related questions. The resistance to getting the vaccine on a part of a significant share of the population. Has this spread to other vaccinations that we've taken for granted all these years? The related part for me is we've had reports of polio emerging in this country. Maybe it's just 1 case or 2 cases, but that shocked me, frankly, as somebody who, when he was a boy, polio was a summer fear constantly. Public swimming pools were danger zones. I don't think younger people appreciate the Salk vaccine coming into our lives in the mid-1950s was like, God had given us this gift, and now people are rejecting this gift. Are we vulnerable to a resurgence of diseases we thought we'd conquered?
There has been a trend towards people mistrusting vaccines even before the COVID pandemic, right? There are all these myths that vaccines cause autism, and so there's been a contingent of parents who have not wanted to vaccinate their kids against measles and not so much polio. The case in Rockland County that you're referring to, that was a case in a Hasidic man, and that population has had historically low vaccination rates. They had a pretty big measles outbreak there a few years ago. So it's not as much of a surprise that we see it in that population.
But we're seeing it, if I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're seeing it also in populations. There was a measles outbreak a couple of years ago, maybe more than a couple, in California, for example, among, affluent, what used to be called yuppies. So something is going even just beyond this Hasidic resistance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there is this bizarre phenomenon where the people who would consider themselves on the left and people who consider themselves on the right are both mistrustful. And even in Brooklyn, which is liberal enclave for the most part, there are a lot of parents who are who think of vaccines as something that pharma companies invented just to make money. There's a lot of that kind of mistrust. So I think we are looking at a more sketchy future in a lot of ways, and if anything, the COVID pandemic has made things worse.
I would think so. To turn to monkeypox, this is, I guess, some would consider a politically incorrect question, but it is almost entirely confined to the gay population, right? So to what degree is this indeed an issue for that one segment of the population, and everyone else does not really need to be vaccinated against it?
Yeah, it's interesting that you said this might be politically
I'm
incorrect.
sure. I mean, look. We lived through the AIDS situation, and that was not just a health epidemic; it was a political crisis and social crisis in many ways. Is this a repeat of that to some degree?
So, a lot of activists I talked to actually want it to be called what it is, which is that at the moment it is, for the most part, among men who have sex with men. 99% of cases in the U.S. and in most of the world. So on the one hand, yeah, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of HIV. We don't want to stigmatize the population, but we do want to speak plainly and say this is the population at risk. Here's how they are at risk, and here's how they can protect themselves. I'm seeing a lot of panic on social media, and even just from people I know worrying about monkeypox who have no reason to worry. People worrying about wearing clothes they bought at a store because the CDC says, you can get it from contaminated clothing. What the CDC means there is if an infected person uses, bed sheets, and then you happen to also sleep in those same bed sheets or touch them, then you might get infected. We're not talking about just buying random clothes out of a store. But I think there is this sort of post-COVID panic, and people are very worried that it affects them. It may eventually. I think if this lasts long enough, those men live with women, they live with kids, they live with older people, and so it may spread out into other populations. But so far, there are 13 women in the US that the CDC has identified, and 2 kids. One of them was just passing through the country. So we're really not there.
Although at one point there were only 13 people who had COVID, and
this is not COVID. This is
Okay.
not COVID, and it won't be. It's actually a pretty inefficient virus, if you will. It has trouble getting from person to person, which is why we haven't seen it in this way before, and now we're seeing it because of all this intimate contact. It needs close contact.
New York City's health commissioner has recommended that we rename monkeypox. He wants to call it something else. Somehow it reminds me of years ago, it was stigmatizing of poor people to call them poor, so we called them disadvantaged or underprivileged. They still didn't have a dime. Is there a point to
There's
this
absolutely.
beyond just a public relations issue?
There is a point. And the point is that you hear monkeypox and you think it has something to do with monkeys, and it has very little to do with monkeys. It was identified in monkeys first, but really rodents were the primary host, and now it looks like the virus has actually adapted to people quite a bit. So to call it monkeypox really doesn't give us any information, and it does carry some stigma for the African countries where it originated.
Okay.
And so, or where it actually has been endemic. And so it's, I think the WHO has been talking about changing the name, and they've been discussing it for several weeks now. They move slowly, but I think they will arrive at some sort of new name for it.
Do we have any idea what some of the candidates are? No.
I have none at
Okay.
all.
All right. I look forward to that one. You speak to scientists, no doubt. What worries them about what's coming next? Surely there's somebody sitting in a lab who's a lot smarter than I am, who's thinking, we have a global wipeout virus coming our way. Do they think like this?
There are so many viruses in animals that can make the leap to people. I was at a virologist conference earlier this week in Madison, Wisconsin, and I talked to a lot of virologists there. They worry mainly about swine flu, which is, virus that is in
Right.
pigs and can jump to people and has before, bird flu. And one of the points that one of the virologists I talked to made, which I think is very important and interesting, is that we worry so much about these viruses coming out of East Asia, but it's just as likely that they'll come from the Americas. Even North America, even the Midwest, which is where this conference was being held. Anywhere where people live in close proximity to animals, those viruses have an opportunity to jump. And so I think really when we talk about new viruses emerging, it's always a question of just when, not if.
So is China unfairly blamed, do you feel, for some of this?
China was very secretive. I mean, they did not do themselves any favors, and everything they did made it seem like they were hiding things, and they probably were. We don't know exactly what those things were, but yeah, I mean, they have a history of not acknowledging problems until they are undeniable. And so I think everybody is right to mistrust them to a certain extent and look more closely than they would want you to.
All right, well, thank you. I think I'm going to go home and watch Contagion again, a movie with Gwyneth Paltrow and Matt Damon. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Apoorva Mandavilli, I really appreciate it. For everyone here at CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman of the New York Times. Thank you for watching.